It's the highest point in the old city of Jerusalem. On the border of the Armenian quarter, Mount Zion is where some of the most significant events of the Old and New Testament are believed to have taken place. Among them, the Last Supper, the burial of King David, and the Virgin Mary falling asleep.
We're standing on the border of the old city overlooking Mount Zion. Can you tell me a little bit of why this place is so significant?
Well, Mount Zion, even though it wasn't called that at the point that it was included within the city of David, is part of the city of David. So really what you're asking is, like, why is the city of David so important? And the city of David is so important because this is where a lot of history, modern history, began, whether it's Jewish history, Christian history, Muslim history. It doesn't matter. This is where Western history began. And it began when this man named David was going to set up his kingdom in this place where you could unite the 12 tribes. And even though there are higher hills around, those higher hills were far enough away that an arrow couldn't hit. So David chose this area, and Mount Zion, even though it wasn't called Mount Zion at that time, became encompassed most likely within the city of David. The city itself grew and shrunk in size, and there's controversy about where exactly the walls were. But what's called the first wall, and was a Hasmonean wall, is pretty much understood by modern scholars to be also where King Solomon, King David built their wall, and it included Mount Zion.
This interesting compound on the top of the mount is linked by two major traditions. The ground floor is where the so-called David's tomb stands. The upper floor holds the hall of the Last Supper. Is it possible that these two significant events took place at the same site? Rabbi Daniel Asor, a rabbi who used to be a priest, doesn't think so.
We're standing underground in part of the complex of the Tomb of David, but it's also the site where Christians believe Jesus Christ had his Last Supper. Rabbi Asor, can you explain some of this conflict?
First, there is a few reasons why the Last Supper could not be here in the upper room, right above the King David tomb. One of them is we can look at the stones and the rocks here that related to the first temple of Jerusalem era to verify that actually that could be the place of where King David was buried. But then when we climb to the upper level, we can see little stones that was built, according to professional archaeologists, 800 years ago. That couldn't possibly be the place of the Last Supper place, because it was not existed in the Second Temple.
However, our tour guide Renee Atlas offers another explanation regarding the identity of the site.
There are scholars who think the lower room is not where King David is buried, and if a king was buried there at all, it was a later king. But that it did serve as a synagogue, at least from the Second Temple period. For example, Hadrian is said to, by later historians in the 4th century, is said to have commented, one of the 7 synagogues still remains after destruction of all of Jerusalem by the Romans. So he comments on the building, but that it's David's tomb was not commented upon, even by Benjamin of Tudela, who came much later. He came in the 12th century, and he said, a king's scepter was found here, and king's raiments were found here, but he doesn't mention that this was the burial place of David either. So there's definitely controversy about who is buried there.
The Cenaculum, the room of the Last Supper, is where one of the most iconic events in the history of religion took place. In his last days before he was crucified, Jesus is eating his last meal with his disciples. The book of Matthew describes this event. And as they were eating, Jesus took a bread and blessed and brake it, and he gave to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And he took a cup and gave thanks, and gave to them, saying, "Drink ye all of it, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many unto remission of sins." Another important site on the mountain is the Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu. According to tradition, this is where Jesus was imprisoned and interrogated before he was sent to his Via Dolorosa, the way of sorrow, and eventually his death.
Right now we're standing on Mount Zion in front of the Church of Gallicantu. What's the history behind this place?
Well, this place was actually the house of the high priest. And when Jesus was taken down by the Romans from the Mount of Olives, which is right behind us, he was brought here to the high priest's house. And he was given an informal trial here. There was a more formal trial the next day, but this is where he was imprisoned overnight, and that's a big part of the significance. Also significant here is the fact that Peter was told by Jesus the night before, "You're going to deny me 3 times before the cock crows in the morning." And Peter said, "No, I won't. Why would I do something like that? You know, I'm your follower. I'm devout. I'm the most devout." And he, in fact, did it. And this is what happened. So they're bringing Jesus down from the mountain, and a woman looks at Peter, who's following him, and saying, "Wait, aren't you part of that crew?" And Peter says, "I am not." Then there's a man who later says, "Wait, you're a Galilean, I recognize you." And Peter says, "Man, I don't know what you are talking about." And then there's a third person who says with full confidence, "You are part of the Jesus followers." And Peter again says, "No, I am not." And as he says those words for the 3rd time, the cock crows.
Outside the church, we can see a miniature model of Jerusalem from the Byzantine era.
Why is there a big blank area?
So the big blank area is not by mistake. The Byzantines kept the Temple Mount empty. They kept it empty because they were trying to make a point. Before Jesus was crucified, he sat, we look over there, we can see the Mount of Olives. He sat on the Mount of Olives, he looked west, and he said, "Do you see that huge structure in front of us, the temple? It's not going to be there. One stone is not going to stand upon another." And he sat there and he wept over the temple. And he said, "The reason is because I'm not being widely accepted." And the Byzantium Empire took that concept and said, "We're going to keep it empty. We're going to make this point so that everyone notices that because Jesus was not widely accepted, the temple was destroyed. That's where the temple was, and there is nothing there now, just as was foretold by Jesus."
The moon will be dismayed, the sun ashamed, for the Lord Almighty will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and before its elders with great glory. These words from the book of Isaiah are just one example that shows the significance of the mountain, which stands high and where one can look up and see thousands of years of history and faith.